future. Yeah. All right, so Olivet Discourse. This is a fun one. I forget who asked me the question, but it involved, it might have been Bev, but she's not here, so hopefully she'll watch the video. Somebody asked me about Matthew 24 and how it was fulfilled in 70 AD, because what a lot of people will attach this to is end of days, right? The day of the Lord. So we're going to go through some terminology. We're going to go through, I'll try to get through this, but there are some things we need to understand before we get to where we can understand this passage. So the first thing we have to understand is that there are a couple of different views when it comes to how people view prophecy. Okay, so there's the preterist. There's the partial preterist. And then there's the double fulfillment. Okay? So, preterist will say that all prophecy in the Bible has been fulfilled already, even Revelation.
And by extension, that means there's no more prophecy.
Yeah, it could be, yes. These will be people who are typically amillennialists, meaning we're currently in the millennial reign of Christ, which is more metaphorical than anything else. So Revelation talks about things that were happening during the Roman Empire. It doesn't have anything to do with things that are yet future. So all prophecy has been fulfilled. Partial preterist will say some, or even they could say most, prophecy has been fulfilled. But there's still the some that is, unlike the preterists, they will say that there is some yet future. Then there's kind of a double fulfillment view, which says all prophecy, or it could be even most prophecy, not necessarily all, has double fulfillment. So it's so for some things you might fall. I am mostly a partial preterist. Okay, so I think that somewhere between some and most prophecies already been fulfilled. Okay, there are things like Revelation, like Daniel's 70th week, stuff like that, that are yet future, but probably most have already happened. Okay, there are some things that you can find in the Bible that are double fulfillment. I don't think this happens as often as people like to believe or like to hope, but we do see double fulfillment. But generally, it's double fulfillment with respect to Jesus. So you see how in Isaiah 9, right, for unto us a child is born, for unto us a son is given, that refers both to the king Isaiah is prophesying to, his son, who is born of a young woman, and it is referred to more perfectly in its secondary fulfillment of Christ born to a virgin. Because that is then pointing, but most of the double fulfillment stuff is Christological in nature. Okay? Any questions on that? So when I teach Matthew 24, I teach it from this perspective, partial preterist.
Well, I think the first one is completely wrong. All prophecy has been fulfilled. Where do they get that?
They get it from reading Revelation as referring to the Roman Empire.
Okay.
So when it talks about the beast and the whore of Babylon and all of that, those are figures within the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire eventually collapses, and so it's fulfilled. Yeah.
And if we were in the millennium, Christ would be in control. of our government.
Uh-huh.
Our government's not under control.
Nope. But they would say that the church is reigning right now, or should be reigning, as Christ's proxy. It's kind of the way they get around that. Christ is ruling in us, and that's, anyway. But yeah, amillennialism is a whole different thing. I'm just saying, amillennial, you usually find these preterists are all millennials, okay? But I'm a partial preterist. So when I look at prophecy, I generally think that most of the biblical canon of prophecy has been fulfilled, and there are things that we can point to in the past that fulfill those requirements. So like when we go through Amos, or even Jonah, right? We've seen how those are fulfilled in time, in history. Some of these things we can't point to, like Revelation. I don't think we can really point to any of that because Revelation is written for the people who are left. Okay, it's written for the Jews specifically that are left, yeah.
Okay. In the end times before Christ returns, doesn't the Bible mention more prophecy, future prophecy?
Which return are you talking about? So yeah, we're getting a little afield. So
I'm talking about when he takes the return that culminates in the 1,000-year reign.
So that's the second coming, the second advent.
Okay,
Yep.
according to you, yes.
So, yeah, that would be the second advent. Yeah, I think that would be when the actual literal millennial reign of Christ will happen.
Yeah, don't they talk about actual prophets, true prophets being
That will be
the,
so biblical.
at that time.
The way. So we're going this way. This is the church age, right? We're in that right now. The church right now, at least according to the way that I interpret Scripture, is restraining the man of lawlessness.
Okay.
Okay? So, it says in Thessalonians that the day of the Lord cannot come until the man of lawlessness reveals himself. But currently he is being restrained. So what is doing the restraining? Well, some will say it's the Holy Spirit. Some will say it's, God himself. Some will say God the Father himself. Some will say, and I think rightly so, that it's the church that is doing the restraining of the man of lawlessness. Because the man of lawlessness is the final culmination of the judgment on Israel. Okay? So when we see Daniel's 70th week, it's God dealing with Israel. Is the church Israel? No. The church is a different word. So in order for God to finally deal with Israel, what has to happen? Paul says the restrainer has to be removed. What is the restrainer? It's this parenthetical insertion that's the church. So 1 Thessalonians says church is raptured out. And now Daniel's 70th week can start. Right? Where God is dealing with Israel. This is when you get Antichrist. This is when you get the 7-year tribulation. This is when you get the signs and wonders again. Because who are signs and wonders for?
Good question.
The unsaved.
So Paul says what? In 1 Corinthians, I think it's 1 Corinthians. He says that the Jews seek after a sign, but the Greeks seek after wisdom. So we're persuaded more by rational arguments as Western thinkers. They need signs to confirm an apostolic or a prophetic ministry. There's another reason why I think a lot of the sign gifts have petered off, because apostolic authority has already been established. So back in the time of Paul and all the rest of them were trying to establish that they were sent from God. They had to do that to the Jews. And so they were doing signs and wonders because prophets in the Old Testament always come with signs and wonders. So you think about it, they knew Moses was sent from God. Why?
Because they were
Signs and wonders.
Miracles.
They knew Samuel was from God, because what did Samuel do? Samuel had some signs and wonders. They knew Isaiah did signs and wonders. Jeremiah did signs and wonders. You have Ezekiel doing signs and wonders. I mean, so it's always a symbol that to the people that God is doing something and that these people have been sent by God. So when it says in the latter days, your daughters and your sons will prophesy, and their young men will dream dreams, and all of that, it's talking about in the 70th week. After this, you get the Battle of Armageddon. Okay, now that you got the 1,000-year reign, the literal 1,000-year reign, right? And then after this, you get the Battle of Gog and Magog. Okay, and that's the final. It's the final battle. Okay, and then you get the establishment of the new heavens and the new earth and all that. So, I know that's eschatology. We're talking about fulfilled prophecy already. This is yet to come. Okay. All right. So, I don't agree with this. I'm in this camp. I see some double fulfillment, but usually when I see it, it's with reference to Christ. Okay? It's double fulfillment. Alright. Another couple of terms we need to come to grips with. The day of the Lord. How many of you think that's a singular day? Like, one-time event. Not just like a day, but a one-time event. There are multiple days of the Lord throughout Scripture. Okay? The day of the Lord is an idiom for judgment. So there are many times, especially as we continue to study the prophets, where you'll see the day of the Lord comes like X. Or in the day of the Lord, this will happen. But clearly it's referring to, as partial preterists, it's referring to a day of judgment that happens within a couple of generations of when the prophecy is given, if not sooner. Okay? The day of the Lord is a type of event. There will be a final day of the Lord, but there are also lots of little ones. Lots of other ones. So, AD 70, what happens to Jerusalem is a day of the Lord. Okay, because it's a judgment. So we need to understand that. The day of the Lord is a type of day referring to a judgment. And then we have to look at this. Because this is a big one. The abomination of desolation is not a one-time event. And again, it's like the day of the Lord. It's an event that happens a couple of times. This one, I think, 2 of them have been fulfilled. 1 of them is yet to come. I think the temple, the 3rd temple, there's going to be another temple that's rebuilt. And there'll be another abomination of desolation. But 2 of them have already happened. Daniel talks about 1. Jesus is going to talk about 1, and there's 1 yet future. And I think that'll be a double fulfillment from Daniel's prophecy. Again, most of them are in reference to Christ, some of them are not. This is one of them that's not. The first time we see the abomination of desolation is by a man named Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes is one of the Seleucid, is he Seleucid? I think he's Seleucid. Greek rulers who had dominion, who ruled over Israel. He goes into the temple during the Maccabean revolt. This is what sparks off the Maccabean revolt. Is he goes into the temple and he declares himself to be God. Okay, an abomination of desolation. That's what. Some people say sacrificing a pig on the altar. That's not what happens. He walks into the temple. He declares himself to be God, thus committing an abomination of desolation. Okay, so that happens during that 400-year silent period between the end of the Old Testament writings, at the end of the Tanakh, and when the New Testament begins in Matthew. And actually, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, all belong to the Old Testament. Okay? The New Testament doesn't start until Acts. So, I know we say it's the New Testament, but really it's a continuation of the Old Testament. So between when the last prophet speaks and then when Jesus comes, there's that 400-year silent period. In that, you have the Maccabean revolt, and Antiochus Epiphanes sets himself up as God in the temple. Okay? You now have, in AD 70, another abomination of desolation, when Rome comes in, and they set up the standard of Caesar in the temple. Caesar, in the Roman Empire, is worshipped as a god. So now you have the Roman standard in the temple under Titus, not Titus from the Bible. I mean, he's a Titus from the Bible. But it's not Titus, the disciple of Paul. This is Titus, the Roman general. Okay? So we have another one who's setting up a false god in the temple. Alright? The third one will be in the third and final temple when the Antichrist does the same thing. Okay? Will go in and he will say, I am God. Right? So this one has happened, this one has happened, this one has not happened. I think people see this term, the abomination of desolation, in Matthew 24, and they assume it's this one. Okay? They assume it's that one. And that's not the case. It's this one. Okay? So let's read. So Jesus is going to foretell, it's Matthew 24, the destruction of the temple. He says, destroy this temple in 3 days, and I will resurrect it. He's talking about his body. But now, Israel has rejected the word of the Lord, has rejected Jesus, and so Jesus is now pronouncing judgment. He prophesies the destruction of the temple, and much like a very good rabbi does, he prophesies what's going to happen, and then he expounds on what's going to happen. So what you will see, the Jews will do this a lot, especially like in Genesis 1, the Genesis narrative. Genesis 1 tells us the order of creation, how it was done, and that kind of thing. Then you look at Genesis chapter 2, and it goes into the specific of how he created man, right? So you have the macro, and then you get in and you get to the micro. That's a very Jewish way of doing things. You get the macro narrative, and then you get a micro narrative that explains something that happens in the macro. So here we have the macro narrative. Jesus is declaring the destruction of the temple, and then Jesus is going to get really specific. Okay? So let's read. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them and said, You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Alright? So he's prophesying the destruction of the temple. Now he's going out, I believe it's the eastern gate. The eastern gate is all walled up right now. And there's a graveyard in front of the eastern gate. The Muslims are pretty funny. They think that a walled up gate and a graveyard is going to stop Jesus from walking through that gate when he comes back, okay? Anyway, I've seen it. It's cool. So out from the eastern gate, you can walk kind of toward the Mount of Olives, all right? Which is this gorgeous olive grove. Right now there are 3 or 4 churches that are there that are all called the Church of the Ascension. One is the Eastern Orthodox Church of the Ascension. One is the Russian Church of the Ascension, the Russian Orthodox Church of the Ascension. And then there's a Catholic one. There's the Ethiopian Orthodox. They all claim that they're the very site where Christ ascended in Acts. All right, it's a claim to fame. All right, so he's exited the temple, and when you're looking from here's the wall around Jerusalem. Okay, here's the temple. Right now, you'd look, there's this mountain that kind of comes up. And right now, sitting up here is the Dome of the Rock, okay? There's a big valley right here called the Valley of Chorazim, okay? You can walk through it. It gets pretty deep. but there's a path that kind of goes from the eastern gate here, across the valley, and over here you have this other mountain that comes down, and on this mountain are where all the olives are, okay? So he goes across, he comes out. You can see the Mount of Olives is higher than the Temple Mount. So you can see where he's standing, you can see all of the temple from across the way, all right? So what he does is they're saying, look at the buildings of the temple, because you can see them from where he's standing. And it would have been amazing to look at, all right? So you think it's weird, he goes straight from saying this to being, to sitting on the Mount of Olives. Well, he's just walked out of the city. They're sitting on the Mount of Olives, or looking at the buildings, okay? So, verse 3. As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately and saying, tell us when these things will be, and what the sign of your coming and of the end of the age. Okay? Alright, the end of the age is not necessarily the end of time. Okay? Again, it's one of these things like the day of the Lord. The age can be a period of time, and by this he's saying the period of time of the temple, the second temple. That age will come to a close. Alright? And that becomes very clear as he starts going through these things. For many will come in my name, saying that I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. This happens. False Christs are popping up all over the place in the first century. And you will hear wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. Okay? Rome is having a really hard time at this point keeping its territories in check because of some very bad policy decisions by the emperor. Okay? They will continue to have a hard time, especially in Israel, up to 70 AD. All right? So there are wars, there are rumors of wars that are flying around, that will be flying around during the time period that Jesus is talking about. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. Again, this all took place shortly after Jesus said this. And these are all but the beginnings of the birth pangs. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you'll be hated by all nations for my name's sake. When did that happen?
Time of Acts and
Yeah. Paul's persecuting the church. And you've got the Colosseum. You've got people being executed and put to death and martyred under Rome. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And false prophets will arise and lead many astray. What do we see Paul giving a warning against constantly? False prophets, false teachers that are rising up in his day when he's writing. I think, 50s and 60s. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved, and the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. What end is he talking about?
The end of the age.
The end of the age. What is the age that is ending? The temple, the second temple period. Okay, we even call the second temple period. We would say period instead of age. Okay. The whole world here is the Roman world, as a testimony to all nations. Okay, there are other nations besides Rome at this point, but it'll be a testimony, all right, to all those nations, and the end will come. So often we think, okay, this is future, so it has to be all the nations that are currently present today that the gospel has to be a testimony to. No. All right. So when you see the abomination of desolation taking place, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand this. So again, he's talking about something like what happened with Antiochus Epiphanes, where he's standing in the holy place declaring himself to be God. Alright? That's why he says let the reader understand, because, Matthew gives us that little hint. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Does Judea still exist today?
Not as a nation, no.
Not as a region, yeah. Not as a, but that's what Jesus is talking about. People in Judea, in this Roman province of Judea. Let them flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on his housetop not go down and take what is in his house. Let the one who is in the field not turn back for his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant in those days, for nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. Why would Jesus mention it not being on a Sabbath?
Jewish law.
Jewish law. So who's this prophecy for? Jews. Why would it not be good to have this in winter?
Hardship.
Because it snows in Israel in the winter. So, for there will be great tribulation, such as not as seen from the beginning of the world until now, and no, and never will be. Okay? Who is he talking to?
It's Jewish. Yeah.
Okay? He's also talking about the temple and the anguish that will come with that. Think about how just the destruction of the Twin Towers is burned into our psyche. Okay? Now, that's just a building where commerce was conducted. That wasn't a place of worship. That wasn't wrapped up in our identity as a place of worship, as a place that is central to our religion. Okay? Think about that. Just the destruction of the temple. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Who are the elect?
Jewish believers in Christ.
Jewish believers in Christ could also be the elected nation. Remember, election in the Bible is all because of service. It's to service. So Israel was elected to be service to God. The church is elected in service to Christ, right? So the election is about service. So the elect in this case is Israel, because Israel was elected to service. So if it wasn't for Israel and believing Israel, these days would not be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and perform great signs and wonders so as to lead many astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand, so if they say, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. Look, here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will the Son of Man coming. Right? Wherever a corpse is, the vultures will gather. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. It will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. Every tribes on the earth will mourn, and the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven in great glory, and will send out the angels with a loud trumpet call, so that they will gather the elect from the four winds and from one heaven to the other. He even says at some point, we don't really have time to go into this, that there will be hail that will block out the sun and all those kinds of things, okay? So, there are some parts of this that have been fulfilled. There are other parts of it that have not yet been fulfilled, okay? Let's jump down to verse 36. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son of Man, but the Father only. Jesus, this is more like the proclamation of a wedding. So there's a kind of knowing that is in an idiom, in a sense, declarative knowing, like a declaration. So like when Paul says, he uses the same word, I committed to know nothing among you except Christ. Right? And him crucified. Does Paul really know nothing but Christ and him crucified? No, it's an idiom, saying, I will declare among you nothing but Christ and him crucified. So when he says no one knows, meaning no one has the right to declare when this is going to happen except for the Father. For as were in the days of Noah, so will the coming of the Son of Man. For in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark. 2 men will be left, or 2 men in the field, one will be taken, one will be left. 2 men will be, or 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one left. Therefore, stay away, for you do not know the day of the hour that the Lord is coming. But know this: if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore, you must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at the hour you do not expect. Who then is the faithful and wise servant, whom his master has set over his household to give food at the proper time? Blessed is the servant whom his master will find doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will have set over all his possessions. And then he talks about the good servants and the bad servants and that kind of thing. So let's talk about this. We need to have a good general timeline. This is where being dispensationally minded helps, okay? Of what happens. So, Jesus gives this prophecy, we'll say it's near the end of his life. Okay, we're in Matthew 24, it's pretty close to the end. So, we'll say maybe, remember, he was born probably 3 BC. Okay, he was crucified around 30. Okay, so the cross is like 30-ish, 80. Okay, I'll make him 33. We'll say this is pretty close to the end. Okay, so think 30, 80. As he's giving this prophecy. All right. According to Jesus, he's coming back soon, right? So, we're thinking that it should be soonish, should be like here, right? Say 40, 45, 50, something like that. What happens that puts that plan on pause?
Persecution of the Christians first and then the Jews second.
Stephen is stoned. Okay? Who is Stephen preaching to and who rejects the message that is offered?
Jews.
Specifically,
Jewish leaders.
the Sanhedrin. Right? Who are representative of national Israel. They reject the gospel. What does Stephen say as he's dying?
Do not hold this against them.
That's Jesus.
Oh. Well, Stephen.
Command my
Stephen could say that.
Does he say, I command my
He
spirit?
said, no, that's Jesus. He says, behold, I see the Son of Man standing at the right hand of the Father. Okay? So he sees Jesus. He says that. There's the throne that God is sitting on. There's a throne next to God's throne, which is Jesus' throne that we're told about. When a king gives a judgment, he stands. So Stephen sees Jesus standing at the right hand of the Father. The idea is pronouncing judgment against Israel. They reject Israel. Who's the very next, several chapters later, who's the character that we're introduced to? Saul of Tarsus. Okay, this is where, and was Saul present for Stephen's stoning?
He was holding.
Yes, he was holding the cloaks. Okay, so many people will say the church began in Acts 2. That is not true. Who does the gospel go to in Acts 2? Who's there?
Everybody, the
The
Catholic
Greeks.
believers. Wait, what?
Jews.
Oh, that's right. It starts with the Jews.
The audience was Jews, practicing Jews, who were there for what holiday? Pentecost.
Pentecost.
So all of these Jews from all over the world come to Israel for Pentecost, And Peter preaches the gospel message to the Jews that are there. What demographic does Peter have a really hard time going to? Gentiles.
Yeah.
He even has a hard time going to a man named Cornelius, who is a proselyte. He's not quite a proselyte. He's called a God-fearing Gentile. He has gone as far as he is willing to go, save circumcision. But he's considered a God-fearing Gentile, which means he practices everything that a Jewish person would except for circumcision. Peter even has a hard time going to him. I mean, there's even this vision that Peter has of like this thing that's coming down and all that, okay? To say, everybody's included now. This is after the stoning of Stephen, but Peter still is reluctant to do this. In fact, we see Peter going back to his old ways and Paul calling him out on it, right? So Saul gets on the scene, and Saul is given a completely different message, right? He says, I am appointing you to be the apostle to the Gentiles. Because these Jews are having a hard time with this, okay? This is when the church age starts. Roughly in Acts 9. Acts 9 to 13, okay? This is why we're called mid-Acts dispensationalists in the GGF. Because we believe this is where the church starts, is in mid-Acts. All right? So if the church starts in mid-Acts, we call this a parenthetical insertion, or an intercalation. Meaning the church is kind of inserted into God's plan. It was always God's plan. It wasn't like plan B, but it was an unrevealed, unprophesied plan of God that gets put in here that interrupts Christ coming soon. Okay? So all the references when we see in Jesus will coming soon, I'm coming, make ready, be watchful, I'm coming soon. The nation of Israel rejects Christ, rejects the gospel, rejects the offer of the kingdom, and you get the church, which is now made up of Jew and Gentiles equally, being equal, and is now this new thing that's being formed. So when we look at Matthew 24, we need to keep this timeline in mind because it's going to be important for the prophecy. Okay? Jesus says the temple will be destroyed. That is the bracket, that is the thesis statement that we have to use for this whole thing, is the temple will be destroyed. When he says, when you see these things, or the generation that sees these things, he's not talking about the generation that is current, the generation that will witness it. He's talking about the generation that he's talking to. 30 AD, 70 AD, 40 years later, there are still going to be people alive who heard Jesus give this prophecy, right? In, I think it's about 53 to about 68, there are these uprisings in Israel. The Jews are becoming increasingly unsatisfied with Roman rule, with things that are happening in Israel. And so there are some revolts that happen over the course of this time period. Okay? They each get put down because there's this, we talked about this before, there will be peace, right? The peace of Rome. So they get put down. Remember one of Pontius Pilate's fears? He's not a very good governor. His fear is that if he doesn't execute Jesus, that the Jews will revolt, and that the city will have to be sieged, and all that kind of stuff. He'll be deposed as governor. He'll be sent to exile. He might get executed for his incompetence. He's scared of this. Okay. After Pontius Pilate's retirement, there's another Roman proconsul, whose name I'm forgetting at the moment, who is reigning during this period of time. Rome stamps out the rebellions, the protests, and that kind of thing. But another one starts to creep up in 70. Okay? So this Roman proconsul sends to Rome for help because he's lost control. So, the general Roman Titus and legions come down, surround the city at Pentecost. They've got it surrounded, they've got siege engines, they've got catapults, they've got the whole nine. They're letting people in, because it's Pentecost, they're letting pilgrims in who want to come celebrate Pentecost, but they're not letting anybody back out. The idea is they had besieged Jerusalem, and it was a very smart move on Titus's part to not let people come back out because he was depleting the water and all the food that was in Jerusalem. He wasn't allowing any of that through.
That's the battle with Masada.
That comes, yes.
Yeah.
That comes later. Josephus tells us, he was a historian at the time, that when Titus finally starts to attack the city, people saw Rome set up, the people who saw Rome set up and all of that, they flee, especially Christians, because they know what Jesus said. So they see what's happening, they recall back to this Olivet discourse, and they flee the city. But there are those who stay. And those who stay end up dying. A lot of them end up dying. I forget what the actual number is, but I was actually pretty shocked by I'm looking it up here because I don't want to give you that number. 1.1 million Jews were killed in this siege. Okay? That's just the Jews. That's not anybody else. But that's 1.1 million Jews were killed in 70 AD. Okay? The temple was also destroyed. I've been there. I've seen where the western wall is. Okay? They don't call it the Wailing Wall anymore, but where the western wall is. I've seen the eastern wall, and they've got an excavation going on down there where they're now pulling up pillars that used to be part of Solomon's colonnade. They've started excavating down that low. So when he said, Josephus tells us that the Romans who went up to the Temple Mount started pushing over the pillars of Solomon's colonnade, and they're down at the bottom. It's got to be 120 feet that they pushed these things down. They destroyed the temple entirely. And it was a persecution like they've never experienced, okay? Rome, then taking control of the temple, seeks to, my God is bigger than your God. That's the idea. They erect inside of the temple the standard of Caesar, which is that eagle, and the SPQR logo, that all go in there and they set it up saying, we've conquered this now. Okay? The stones that they were throwing, the siege stones that they were throwing, were so large that at times, Josephus tells us, it blacked out the sun. The smoke was so bad you couldn't see the stars, you couldn't see the moon even, because of all the fires that were raging in Jerusalem at the time. So when we look at some of this stuff, and I wish we could go into more detail, but we're kind of closing out here. Signs of the end of the age, okay? 70 AD. But by this point, the church has already come into it. So the angels, the trumpet, all of that isn't happening because the church is here. But the temple is destroyed, the city is sieged, there's persecution, there's 1.1 million Jews dying, there's then Masada that happens, and the suicides that happen there. And that was just the siege of Jerusalem. That's not even what happens in the rest of Israel as they're starting to put down revolts. And it was really, in a lot of ways, it was the beginning of the end of Roman dominance throughout the world, because people were starting, more and more rebellions started happening in the furthest reaches and provinces and stuff like that. So, yeah, anyway, any questions before we close? We might revisit this later, but...
And now, a double prophecy, which means you be held to that. You'd say, well, this happened once in 70 AD, and it could be the way things go down at the end of times.
Could be.
Yeah.
Could be. Yep. But yeah, I think when Jesus says in this generation, he's talking about the generation he's talking to.
Sure.
So, anyway, that's kind of the partial preterist view, is looking at it like this, and then saying the stuff that Jesus is talking about, the coming of the Son of Man and all of that, that'll happen later. So when John writes Revelation, it's from the perspective that this has already happened, but there was an expectation that Jesus would come back, and he hasn't yet. What's up? So I think that's why John writes Revelation. That's why Paul writes some of the stuff that he does, because there's this move away from the expectation. There's a like I said, it's an intercalation. It's like God hit the pause button on one program, starts the other program, and then when this program that we're in finishes out, then he'll push play on the Jewish program again. Amen.
In fact, Paul in one of the books says that people have stopped working and they just basically they're just waiting for the day of the Lord.
Yep.
So nope.
Nope. He says, "Work, be diligent. You don't work, you don't eat."
Yeah,
that was that whole.
Be diligent. It's not yet.
Yep. Keep working because it's not here yet. But yeah, that's anyway.
Very good.
Olivet Discourse.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Brian, I think I locked my keys in my office.
Oh, okay. No worries. Although I did see a nice stack of keys in the second pew, but I figured that was Ashley.
That might have been her. I opened my office after church, so I think that's what happened.